Their family boasted 11 cardinals, 2 popes, a saint, and numerous political leaders, but the Borgias were far from the pious, holy men and women that their positions in the Catholic Church would suggest. While they didn't invent political corruption, it was clear they mastered it, shattering all 10 commandments before breakfast and living the 7 deadly sins more hardcore than a bachelor party weekend in Vegas. They could be one of history's OG crime families. Dysfunction, debauchery, and maybe some light incest. The Borgias became one of the most powerful families in the late 14 and early 1500s. But with massive corruption and massive crime comes a massive enemies list. The two Borgia popes were also partially responsible for the Protestant Reformation. Their mark on history was undeniable. Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick, and with me, as usual, is my lovely wife, the unqualified and unapologetic Kimberly. So, Kim, are you excited to take a look at the OG political corruption, organized crime, and super dysfunctional family with an early Renaissance twist?
Nothing gets me more excited than a family tree with more stems than branches. I mean, if toxic relatives were an Olympic sport, they would have taken home all the gold and probably poisoned the judges just for good measure.
Yeah. The Borgias had their finger in all the pies in the 15th and 16th centuries, but would it be during the time of Pope Alexander VI, aka Rodrigo Borgia, that the family really hit their bloody stride? To say the family was connected would be an understatement along the lines of saying Elon Musk has some money.
Calling them connected is like saying the ocean's a bit damp. These people didn't network, they webbed. They were basically the Federal Reserve with a side hustle in murder and mayhem.
Their story starts in Spain as the Borgia family. The two Boyer cousins, Domingo and Rodrigo, arranged a marriage between their kids, Isabella and Joffrey. Years later, Isabella's brother, Alfonso de Borgia, was elected Pope Calitus III. He was a compromise candidate at 77 years old and sickly. He was supposed to hold the throne of St. Peter just long enough for the church to find a good successor. His time as pope had limited success. He launched a failed crusade to take Constantinople from the Turks. The Christian kings of Europe had little support for this cause, and Calactus sold off church art and land and indulgences, which is a writ of forgiveness for your sins, along with cardinates and annulments, in addition to imposing a tax to pay for his crusades and, of course, line his own pockets. He also promoted two of his nephews to cardinals. One was Isabella's son, Rodrigo Borgia, as the name was said in Italian. Callictus, heavy-handed rule and anti-Jewish pronouncements, and his super unpopular crusade, along with open theft and blatant nepotism, made him very unpopular across most of Europe. His one shining light might have been his annulment of the charges against Joan of Arc, clearing her of heresy and saving the legacy of the Maid of Orleans. When he died in 1458, after only 3 years in power, the power players in the Vatican turned against his cronies. The Catalans, as the Spanish were called, were driven from Rome, but his nephew, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, managed to avoid the purge.
Oh, so this is the part where Rodrigo trades in his rosary for a crime family starter kit. Basically, the original Godfather, just for more incense and fewer ethics.
I wonder if anybody ever told him to leave the gun and take the cannoli.
Ha ha ha.
In 1492, around the same time Columbus was talking to Isabella and Ferdinand about sailing west to get east, Rodrigo was buying a papal election. He was able to pay off 17 of the 22 cardinals voting in the conclave. His career had been built by his uncle, Pope Callictus. He was made a cardinal at 25 years old and vice chancellor of the Holy See at 26. While vice chancellor, he built great wealth and started producing illegitimate children. Both of these activities continued under Pope Pius, who followed his uncle to St. Peter's throne. Pius, however, did warn Rodrigo to take it easy with the orgies because it was unseemly. For the next few decades, he spent his time violating his vows, the whole poverty and chastity thing, gaining powerful friends and powerful enemies, and maneuvering himself into the position to get even more power. It would take 34 years before he rose to pope. During that time, he had 7 children. In a weird bit of church tradition, the man who had fathered at least 7 children had to undergo a gender confirmation test. This was not because he wanted to use the bathroom in a southern state here in the US, but possibly because of Pope John, who reigned from 855 to 857 and is rumored to have been a woman. The test required him to sit in a chair with the middle part of the seat missing so that his junk could be viewed by people around him. Rodrigo slash Alexander would take the unusual position of actually claiming paternity of at least 4 of his children. He was not secretive about his primary mistress, Venosa Catanetti. There were other children by other women, but she was the one he was most open with. Rodrigo, now Pope Alexander VI, was not the first pope to acknowledge his children. That honor goes to his immediate predecessor, Pope Innocent VIII. Innocence, the ironically named, set the precedent of heaping wealth and honors on his children. Alexander would not only follow this, but exceed anything Innocent ever thought of. He was able to use his children to make alliances through marriage. That was, of course, the norm for powerful ruling families of Europe, but he would excel at it. His daughter Lucrezia was married 3 times, and each marriage having its political advantage.
So Pope Alexander really took father of the church way too literally. And as for Lucretia, she wasn't just daddy's little girl. She was daddy's favorite political strategy.
But let's start with his firstborn son by Venosia, Caesar. Born in 1475 or 1476, it's a little shady as the fact that he was illegitimate, although he would get claimed by his father, but at first it was kind of hush hush. He was most likely born in Rome. He was the fourth of Cardinal Borgia's illegitimate children and his second son, but he would become the most famous. As a young man, Caesar had it all: tall, good looks, money, brains, and a family with real power. His father was, at the time, the vice chancellor of the Papal States, and Pops was going to make sure that his son was set up just as his uncle had done for him. Like most second sons in powerful families with church connections, Caesar would be educated for a life in the church. But first, in 1480, his father used his position in the Vatican to get Pope Sixtus IV, I love that name, Sixtus IV, to clear Caesar of his stigma of being a bastard. This opened the way for the young man to hold office within the church. First, though, his education had to be taken care of, and it was an impressive education. Private tutors, some of the most brilliant minds in Italy, universities, and a degree in both canon and civil law. When Rodrigo became Pope Alexander in 1492, Caesar became the Bishop of Valencia at just 17 years old. 1 year later, his father made him a cardinal, one of 47 cardinals appointed by Alexander, strengthening his hold over the church. All of this despite it being a well known fact that Caesar was not actually religious. In fact, in the Vatican, he was better known for hunting, having numerous affairs, and dressy fancy than doing any actual religious work.
And the nepotism's in full bloom now. 17 years old and already Archbishop. The Vatican basically became his personal runway for sin and silk.
The family was struck with tragedy in 1497 when Giovanni Juan Borgia was murdered. Juan was the second son by Venosia and Alexander's favorite. Pops the Pope sent Juan to Spain in 1493 with the plan to set the kid up in the Spanish royal court. But things weren't working out all that well. At this particular moment in time, Queen Isabella was not exactly happy with the Pope, how he had been using his position to make a lot of money and promote his family. A marriage had also been arranged for Juan with the daughter of the powerful Enriquez family. The couple would have two children, but Juan had been complaining all this time about not wanting to live in Spain. So he asked his dad to send ships to take him back to Rome. But for the time, he was needed in Spain. His father needed him to play nice with Isabella and Ferdinand. Juan was also at the time leading the papal armies as they were aiding Spain in their conflict with France. This would keep the French at bay. But when the French backed down in 1496, Daddy sent the ships to get his favorite son. He would leave his son and 2-month pregnant wife behind when he returned to Rome. Arriving in Rome to a hero's welcome, Juan was quickly placed in charge of leading the papal armies against their enemies to the north, the Orsini family, who had sided with the French in a clash of religious and political interest. His military career was mixed at best, but he was still given honors. This made others angry as they believed he was getting honors that should rightfully go to them. In addition, Pops the Pope had decided to grant Juan numerous estates in Spain and Italy that should have rightfully gone to other people. A few members in the church and the Spanish ambassador warned the Pope that this was a bad idea, but Alexander wouldn't listen. On the 14th of June, 1497, Juan had been at a family dinner in his mother's home. After dinner, he left with Caesar, his valet, and a masked man who had not given his name, but had been with Juan all evening. Reportedly, Caesar told his younger brother to return to him with the papal residence, but Juan said he was going to go out and look for fun somewhere else. Then Juan, the valet, and the masked man rode off. Now, the rest is the account of the valet. According to the valet, the three rode to the Square of the Jews, where Juan told him to wait, and if he didn't return by 8 o'clock, to return to the palace without him. Then he and the masked man rode off. Juan was never seen alive again. When his body was found floating in the Tiber River just 2 days later, the Pope rightfully freaked out, yelling he was going to start reforms and end all nepotism in the church. Of course, he didn't do that, and after a few days of frantic investigations, the Pope suddenly ordered an end to the search for Juan's killer. No killer was ever brought to justice, but the quick end to the investigation and what happened next led many people to point the finger at Caesar.
Here's where the Borgia family drama goes full true crime special. This wasn't a family, it was a Renaissance soap opera with better costumes and more bodies.
In 1498, Caesar became the first person to ever resign as a cardinal, then quickly took control of the papal armies, the position his late brother had held. He was also married to a family member of King Louis XII. This was after a failed attempt to marry him off to the King of Naples' daughter. This new marriage set up an alliance between the Pope and France and gave papal approval to the French claims to Naples. Caesar then started to use assassination and siege warfare to place northern Italy under the control of the Papal States. 1500 was a wild year for the Borgias. Caesar returning to Rome a hero, literally dragging a noblewoman who had been captured in one of his sieges into Rome, tied up in golden chains. It was Rome's Jubilee, and they were going to celebrate like it was, well, 1500. One celebration, they brought 50 prostitutes into the papal palace and had them compete with palace servants for best performance. Now, I couldn't find any actual details on what these performances
You
included.
don't want to know.
Yeah, considering who was invited, you could probably guess. Caesar and Lucrezia watched as Alexander judged and then rewarded a prize for the best performance. When a drunk partygoer criticized Caesar, they cut off his hands and cut out his tongue.
A fun way to get a critic to be quiet.
But maybe the worst, 5 criminals were brought to St. Peter's Square to stand before the Pope. Alexander and Lucrezia stood on a balcony as the criminals pleaded their case for papal forgiveness. On a second balcony, Caesar, dressed in all black, stood with a servant, also dressed in all black. As the men begged for papal reprieves, a shot rang out, and one man fell dead, shot in the head. The men began to panic, and a second shot was fired, and a second man fell dead. It was Caesar. The servant stood at the ready, handing Caesar a newly loaded musket with each shot. Each shot found its mark, and all 5 men lay dead. The Pope then turned to his son and said, "Good shooting."
The Borgias didn't just redefine family dysfunction, they turned it into dinner theater. I mean, nothing says year of our Lord 1500 like golden chains, drunken talent shows, and the Pope giving his son a high five Yelp review for public execution.
Jubilee gifts poured into the Vatican coffers and straight into Caesar and Alexander's pockets. When the Pope created 9 new cardinals, sold for thousands each, the money was split between himself and his son. Just a little family grifting. Now, don't worry, we'll come back to Caesar, but we have to turn to Lucrezia, who would face her own kind of tragedy in 1500. Lucrezia Borgia was born in 1480, and it was said she was as beautiful as she was deadly. At 11, she'd already been betrothed twice, and it had been broken off, both times by her father, then Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia. When he became pope, he married her off to Giovanni Sorvosa in order to establish an important political alliance. The marriage was by proxy. So what that means is they had a separate husband take the vows with Lucrezia and a separate wife take the vows with Giovanni. And then months later, they came back together and had like the official wedding. In between the time of the proxy wedding and the real thing, she lived in a palace next to the Vatican with the Pope's new younger mistress. This allowed Alexander to visit his daughter while in fact seeing his mistress. The real wedding took place. The Pope's mistress led 500 women who attended the bride.
Lucretia, the original Renaissance it girl, with more canceled engagements than a celebrity on social media. And of course, Daddy Dearest turns her love life into Vatican power move. Nothing says family values like marrying off your daughter while sneaking next door to visit your mistress.
It was far from a love match, as Lucrezia reportedly found Giovanni to be boring. She was also prone to look for fun with other men. After 2 years of marriage, it was decided that Giovanni was no longer needed. Other political alliances has made the marriage pointless from a political perspective. Getting rid of him would open up the chance to use Lucrezia to form other alliances. Giovanni either wouldn't or couldn't consummate the marriage, which gave the Borgias an easy out. But he refused to go along with the plan and refused to admit his inability to do the deed. It was even suggested by family members that he take Lucrezia while members of both families watched. He refused, and Lucrezia then told Caesar that it might just be best to murder Giovanni.
Nah, might as well.
Yeah, and it's not like Caesar had issue with killing people, even family members. She then warned Giovanni, who quickly skipped town. She was then able to claim abandonment So he accused her with incest with Caesar, Alexander, and Juan. Things ended as best they could for Giovanni, considering who he was dealing with. He finally agreed to an annulment and signed a confession of impotence, but he got to keep Lucrezia's dowry. This would be far better than her next husband would fare. During the whole messy divorce, Lucrezia was hiding out in a convent. Her father had arranged to have a young nobleman act as a messenger between himself and Lucrezia. Of course, this turned into an affair and she got knocked up. It was just after that that Vatican officials officially stated that she was a virgin, a statement backed up by her soon to be ex husband, Giovanni. So these Vatican officials literally said that a pregnant Lucretia Borgia was a virgin. And her soon to be ex husband said, "Yeah, that's right. We've never had sex." When Caesar found out about the pregnancy, he decided it was time to defend little sister's honor. He found the young man actually kneeling before the Pope and showing a lack of any decorum at all. He stabbed the young man through the gut, splashing blood on Pops the Pope. The man survived but was thrown into prison. I guess I guess you go to prison for being stabbed in front of the Pope. Keep that in mind if we're ever in Vatican City.
Yeah, it won't happen.
The man survived but was thrown in prison. 6 days later, he somehow fell into the Tiber River from his cell and drowned. His body was pulled from the river along with Lucrezia's handmaid, who had reportedly helped facilitate the affair. The child was born in secret and 3 years later appeared at the papal court. Alexander issued a papal bull or order that said the boy was a, quote, child of Rome, making the illegitimate child a full citizen, not a bastard. The story started to go around that the boy was actually the child of Caesar and, quote, some woman. Then a second papal bull was issued stating the child was, in fact, the son of the Pope, who was 67 at the time, so not impossible, but unlikely considering it was the 1500s. This was done to give the boy a claim to lands, but helped fuel a lot of the incest rumors that had followed the Borgias.
Nothing says Holy Family like a scandal. This whole story is just therapy waiting to happen.
Lucretia, now 17, that's right, all of this happened before she would be legally an adult if she were around today, is set up for her second marriage, this time to another 17-year-old Alfonso, the Prince of Aragon. Okay, that's Aragon, not Oregon. We don't have princes here. At first, the marriage seemed great, and the two youngsters were even happy. But politics of the Renaissance being what they were, soon the alliance set up by the marriage was broken. The Pope swore to his son in law that he was still in the Pope's good graces. But there were signs. The biggest was when Alexander appointed Lucrezia, now 19, governor of a region of the Papal States, making Alfonso a powerless consort. For her part, Lucrezia wasn't just a figurehead. She actually ran the region and, by all accounts, did an excellent job. While the couple were expecting their first child, Alexander urged them to return to Rome. I mean, this makes perfect sense, right? Baby girl, have her come back when she's having the baby so you can be around. They would have a boy and named it Rodrigo, after the Pope's original name. And it seemed like a happy little family. Then, one day in 1500, as Alfonso was walking across St. Peter's Square, he was attacked by a group of men and gravely wounded. It appeared he was going to survive, however. While he was being nursed back to health by Lucrezia, Caesar burst into the room and ordered everybody out. Then he ordered one of his henchmen to strangle Alfonso. Alexander saw his daughter and the others running out of the room. Lucrezia told her father that Caesar was in the room with Alfonso acting crazy. The Pope knew exactly what Caesar was up to and sent men to try and stop him. But by the time they arrived, Alfonso was already dead. It seems that the first group of men who had attacked him were sent by Caesar but failed. So he made sure the second attempt succeeded by attending to it personally.
Why let family therapy fix it when murder will do? At this point, family dinner must have come with a side of bodyguards and trauma.
So, why did Caesar feel the need to kill his brother in law? Alfonso's position in the family was interfering with Caesar's dealings with the French. He was also not happy that Alfonso was starting to become more popular than him. Alfonso made the mistake of gaining more influence, and Caesar likely saw him as a potential rival. Even though a powerless consort, Caesar might have felt that Alfonso was becoming a threat to his position in central Italy. 1501, Alfonso's father lost his holdings to the papal armies, which were being led by Caesar. When the Pope traveled to inspect the new holdings, he left his 21-year-old Lucrezia in charge. The cardinals, you would think, would be up in arms over a woman left in charge of all Christendom, but they just rolled their eyes. It was one more crazy moment in the reign of Pope Alexander. The Pope was out gaining huge sums of cash for Caesar's military adventures and a new dowry for Lucrezia.
Pope Alexander strikes again, handing the reins to Christendom to a 21-year-old Lucretia like it's a casual weekend babysitting gig. The Cardinals just shrug, because honestly, at this point, what's a little female led chaos in the middle of this insanity?
The plan now was to marry Lucrezia off once more, hopefully this time to a royal family. It was Caesar who found her next husband, and it was another Alfonso, just because we really got to make things confusing, but it was Alfonso, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. His property set next to Caesar's own holdings. This was a good match for Caesar, but also for Ferrara. Lucrezia was still just 21, beautiful, smart, and fun loving. She also came with a huge dowry and a repealing of Ferrara's papal taxes. That's right, marry the Pope's daughter, don't have to pay taxes no more. Ferrara was described as a strong silent type with interest in artillery, music, and brothels, but he seemed totally devoted to his new bride, Lucrezia. Now, in addition to being a governor and running for a short term the papal states, it was said that Lucrezia had a habit of poisoning people who pissed her off. So, whether love or fear, they seemed to actually have had a solid marriage, and he was loyal, at least by early 1500 standards. She, however, had an affair with the poet Pietro Bimbo. Evidence supports the idea that the affair might have never actually become physical, but judging by the letters he sent to her, he was deeply in love with her. With a little over 500 years hindsight, he was probably better off not sleeping with her. Lucrezia and Alfonso, the new one, had 4 children together and also took on raising Rodrigo from her second marriage and her brother nephew son from the affair she had while her first marriage was ending. However, both those boys were eventually sent to live with Isabella of Aragon. Lucrezia supported Caesar in his various military actions and supposedly helped both her brother and her father dispose of political and personal rivals. But unlike their father, who died in 1503 at the age of 77, neither Lucrezia or Caesar would live to an old age. Caesar's later years were not great. First, the once handsome, dashing man who could have any woman he wanted ended up disfigured. By 1503, his face had become scarred and pockmarked, likely from syphilis. He reportedly wore a leather mask or kept his face partially covered at all times. But his trouble really started with the death of his father. At first, things didn't go too bad. Alexander had created enough cardinals that the next pope was loyal to him and his family. Pope Pius III reconfirmed Caesar as the leader of the papal armies, but Pius III only lasted for 26 days. The next pope, Julius II, was a die-hard enemy of the Borgias, causing Caesar to flee to Spain.
Suddenly, being the original Renaissance bad boy doesn't look so fun.
In Spain, Caesar was in the doghouse with Ferdinand II. It was a supposed ally who would actually turn on Caesar, but instead of being a friend, the noble captured Caesar and had him tossed in prison. After a first failed escape attempt, Caesar was eventually able to break out of prison, then was able to persuade King John III of Navarre to hire him to command his armies, as he was facing a possible invasion from Castile. He was successful in his time leading John's forces. However, on the 11th of March, 1507, he had laid siege to a castle. Then he saw a small party of knights had broken out of the castle and were trying to flee. So Caesar and his men took off after the knights. As he closed in on the knights, he realized his men hadn't followed him. Once the knights noticed Caesar was on his own, they turned and attacked. He was brutally hacked up. His body was stripped, naked, with even his leather mask being taken. His body was left on the ground, naked, with his genitals covered by a red tile. Lucrezia, for her part, received news that her son Rodrigo had died in Aragon at 13. In a state of depression, she retired to a convent, but later returned home and gave birth to another child. She had always had issues with her pregnancy, including several miscarriages and at least one stillborn. But this time, it was harder. Following the birth, she contracted fever and died on the 24th of June, 1519, just shortly before her 39th birthday. While rumors had circulated throughout her life that she was involved in numerous murders and was a famed poisoner, and was said to have committed incest with her father and brothers, although no evidence supports this accusation, she died a pious, loving mother. Caesar would become the model for Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, whose key to a rise in power is based on the idea that it is better to be feared than loved. He also, at one point, had actually employed Leonardo da Vinci as his military engineer. But what he is most remembered for is his brutal and bloody reign. While the family's power waned after the death of Alexander, they would continue to play a role in the politics of the Papal States and Spain for some years to come. The next generation of Borgias showed many of the same traits that had given their grandfather and parents power. They just weren't quite as good at being bad. At least one Borgia, however, would reject the family business of bribery, theft, and murder. Francis Borgia, born in 1510, his early years were typical Borgia, wealth and a good life. Later, though, he witnessed the decomposing body of Empress Isabella of Portugal, who he had long admired. This led to a spiritual awakening, causing him to reject the power, money, and debauchery that came with being a Borgia. He joined the Jesuits and then became the third superior general of the order. Under his leadership, the order grew exponentially. He died in 1572 and was canonized as a saint in 1671. This would do little to reform the Borgia's name in history, however,
One Borgia tried being good. One saint doesn't exactly erase centuries of family dysfunction.
and they definitely were highly dysfunctional. This has been History is Criminal. Join Kim and I next week as we peel back some of the gilding off of Hollywood's golden age by looking at the murders surrounding Lana Turner. Until then, if you like what you heard, tell a friend. And if you didn't, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.